Today's story is a story of chess, deception, mass torture, and survival. And the worst thing behind all this darkness of the monastery in the name of Mariam Sulakiotis, victims of which became at least 177 people. As you've already guessed, today we're going to talk about faith and murders, and it's going to be a very tough episode, so sit back, dear ones. This is scary. Some considered her a monster, while others revered her as a saint. Very little is known about this woman's early life, and as is often the case, the facts that do exist are shrouded in mystery. Nonetheless, she was definitely born in Greece, in the town of Keratea, about 31 miles south of Athens. As for the year of her birth, some sources indicate 1883, others 1900. I suggest simply focusing on the fact that it was the end of the 19th century. Times were tough for everyone, but especially for women from poor families. Some media claim that from childhood and throughout her youth, Mariam worked on her family's farm. Others say that was only for a while, and after the farm she worked at a factory to somehow earn a living for her family. In any case, it's clear that Mariam was deprived of wealth and power from birth. Therefore, the girl was well acquainted with religious orders, even grew up in a family that strictly adhered to Orthodox faith. And at the beginning of the 20th century, she became a nun in one of the Orthodox churches. Why did Mariam eagerly go into the nunnery? Well, there are several versions here. According to one of them, the girl's faith over the years became stronger, so she decided to dedicate her life to God. According to another, Mariam already knew that if she was looking for goodness and influence, it was only within the walls of churches and monasteries. And there is a third version. The girl fell in love with her religious instructor, Bishop Metzius of Karpatakis. And indeed, whatever the reason for the beginning of her monastic life, what happened next was more important. Even in the first years of service in the church, no one noticed anything about Mariam that was not godly. On the contrary, she and Meti were seen as incredibly blessed people who lived by the word of God. The story of Mariam began to unfold when the Greek Orthodox Church adopted a new calendar in May 1923. It switched from Julian to Gregorian. Father Meti Karpatakis did not accept such innovation. He was a staunch traditionalist and did not want to follow the new orders. Bishop Sviato believed that changes would mean the fall of true religious values, such as discipline and asceticism. As a sign of protest, the churchmen put the followers of the old calendar to sleep, the members of which strictly adhered to the established rules. And he was helped in all this by the nun Mariam, who left the Greek Orthodox Church following her mentor and was getting closer to him. Mariam and Matthew began to develop plans for their own monastery. In 1925, the nun acquired about 3.5 hectares of land between the town of Keratea and the village of Kakitalasa. To this day, there is no clear explanation as to where the nun got the money for such a large purchase. But whatever it was, they showed up. And in 1927, Mariam, along with Meti, founded the Panagia Pevkovu Nogiatrisa Monastery, or as it was later more simply called in the English-speaking world, the Monastery of the Virgin in the Pines. Pevkovu Nogiatrisa, apparently, means quite a lot, and it came to me all at once with the fifth. Meta was blessed. Meti insisted that the monastery, besides glorifying the word of God, financially supports the ancient calendar movement and its followers. And he also had to become a place where anyone could receive treatment for tuberculosis. The founders of the monastery and ordinary people at that time were convinced that the fresh mountain air where the monastery was located had a healing effect. Could this really cure tuberculosis? Unlikely. But since the medical treatment at that time was not very advanced and few could afford it, they had to rely on healing powers, either God or nature. At the time of the monastery's founding, Meti was already 66 years old. His church power, which was in a serious state, was weak, and he was looking for someone who could replace him. This person became Mariam herself. When Methuselah turned 78, he practically retired from affairs. Hocha remained the main incumbent on paper. The churchman delved deeper into ascetic monastic practices. He fasted for almost 10 days, voluntarily isolating himself in locked premises, attaching heavy metal chains to his body and walking like that. His obligations from 1939 were almost entirely taken over by Mariam. Along with the change of leadership, the orders also changed, and the nuns, so to speak, pursued a more vigorous policy. This led to the acquisition of new lands. Mariam ordered the monks and nuns of the monastery to search for them all over Greece, but not just anyone, but preferably the most capable. The rich were convinced that they were sinners who would burn in hell all their lives. If they just don't go to the monastery to pray, don't turn their backs on their families, and don't start donating their fortunes to the monastery's needs. This was the last, if not the only thing that could save their souls. It's uncertain if these prophecies are genuine or mere manipulations, causing people to send their relatives to the monastery. However, it was also lonely. The matter was not limited to prayers and sacrifices alone, and with each passing year, Mariam became more demanding and passionate. Leaving the monastery was practically impossible, as was stopping the constant sacrifices. She simply did not agree. Those who do not give everything have weak faith. And indeed, they should punish themselves physically for their faith is not strong enough. And those who could not cope with such, so to speak, obligations were helped. The disobedient were forcibly locked in the monastery basements, deprived of food and water, and subjected to beatings and torture. But everyone had a primary hope. People thought that if they fulfilled the requirements that God himself set in the face of the monks, they would be released. That as soon as they give all their property to the monastery, they can return to their families. However, I didn't just say that Nadia was prim. In truth, most of those for whom the monastery became a prison never saw the light of day and never tasted freedom. They were simply killed in the monastery. Later, journalists speculated about the possible profit from such a business, if you can call it that, in the case of Mariam, and the numbers are simply staggering. For her tortures, Mariam received 300 buildings and farms all over Greece, kilograms of gold and various valuables, the cost of which today would be over 3 billion hryvnias. For example, one of the women, Margot, who ended up in the monastery and survived the torture, gave away a fortune that would be worth almost $32 million today. But the most precious thing the woman could save was life itself. In the fallout with her family, Baka, things turned out to be much more tragic. Mariam convinced her father and mother to join the monastery along with their 3 children. And initially everything was based on goodwill. The family wanted to believe in the salvation of souls by sacrificing everything they have. Well, it's their right. However, Ms. Baka quickly realized that the conditions they are now forced to live in are deplorable. She also informed the nuns that her family wants to leave the monastery. However, along with Ms. Baka, Mariam refused to spend part of her fortune. If the reality could allow for any soul to be in the status of the forgotten, then to allow for coins and property to receive the same status was clearly too much for her. So Mariam was punished by being locked in a solitary room, where she had previously received the sick with tuberculosis. The nuns didn't let her eat at first, then they prepared some kind of inedible gruel. Ms. Baka prayed for help day and night, as long as she had the strength. Ultimately, it didn't yield any results. The nuns and monks played by the rules of the monastery, while the building itself was falling into ruin. Help was sought here for years. In such conditions, Bronca spent half a year, and when her captors released her, she fell into a coma and died unexpectedly. Her husband, Mr. Baka, suffered a similar fate. He died in his cell. What happened to the children is unknown. Rumor has it that they ended up living in a monastery. I hardly want to live here. I'd rather sleep and work. They also suffered the terrible tortures of Mariam, the mysterious mistress of Mr. Yotupulu. The monastery was so persistent that the Lord, having forgiven them all their sins, needed to let faith into their hearts and souls, which in practice meant to start living in the monastery and renounce all temptations, including their luxurious building, for the benefit of the monastery. One of their friends starved to death in a basement room of the building meant for them. Not all Mariams were initially confined to the rooms. There were those who really joined and served God along with the community of the monastery. But I suspect she was such a despotic woman who put discipline and her authority above everything. Also, no one dared to say a word against her. All the nuns learned this lesson from the terrible incident that happened with Sister Theodot, the nun who dared to stand up against the excessive severity that Mariam showed to those who came to the monastery. The woman paid dearly for her audacity. Mariam accused her of sinful behavior and punished the other nuns to beat the sinner, herself included. The nuns carried out the punishment reluctantly, so relentlessly that Sister Theodot started bleeding internally and the woman died. But that's not all. Remember, I said that the monastery that Mariam opened had become a place where people came to recover from tuberculosis. Well, in words, maybe it was so, but definitely not in deeds. Mariam was always there to make sure everyone adhered to strict ascetic practices. No healthy person can withstand living in a cold room or sleeping on the floor in winter. What about those who suffered from tuberculosis? The sick were not given any medicine. They were forced to live in inhumane conditions. Doctors were also not allowed to them. They were only released when someone died. Even then, a death certificate had to be issued. For example, when Sister Mihalaku contracted tuberculosis, she decided to go to the monastery. She had heard that there she could receive free treatment and also find spiritual fulfillment. Instead of medical examinations and spiritual practices, they simply locked the girl in a room. As soon as she signed over the rights to her property, she gave up everything she had and they left Mariam to die alone. Today, she became so weak that she didn't even make the last breath in agony. Tuberculosis, in Mariam's opinion, never disappeared, and so did the alienation from people that lasted for years. According to the legend, in the late 1940s, two drunk men decided to find out what was happening behind the walls of the dark monastery. They broke in and found a woman chained to the wall. The men wanted to help her escape, but then, despite her obvious distress, she asked them not to touch her. Speaking, she said she must finish the ritual, otherwise her soul would not be saved. Whether this was true or not, I can't say for sure. And indeed, it seems that in 1949, Mariam did attract the attention of the police. And this was a split second after 10 years of all her unfortunate actions. Indeed, they have filed a serious charge. This was done by the daughter of a wealthy woman who had willingly given up all her property to the monastery. The daughter insisted that her mother would never have done this willingly. Therefore, the monastery must be investigated. The girl was convinced that threats and blackmail were being carried out there, but there were apparently few such accusations to put Mariam under suspicion. And who would believe that the revered temple matron, practically a holy woman, could engage in illegal activities? Fortunately, the investigators decided to look for a bit more information about her. Perhaps they went on this because they couldn't understand how Mariam managed to buy so many hectares of land to build a monastery in her time. In the end, the detectives stumbled upon such a find. It turned out that Mariam was involved in the illegal export of olive oil to Cyprus and the illegal import of tires. In addition, in 1949, a man named Christos Peraides came to the police with a statement. He reported that his 18-year-old daughter had disappeared. The girl is a native of Greece, but lived with her family in the United States of America. And now she came to her father's homeland as a tourist. During one of these trips, she mysteriously disappeared. The Federal Bureau of Investigation of the United States started a search and determined that all leads point to the Mariam Monastery. And he was convinced that his daughter was kidnapped by the priest and the nun herself. She, Mariam, supposedly came to the States to steal a valuable worth $10,000, which his daughter allegedly donated to the monastery under pressure. This gave the police more reason to start an active investigation. Then the detectives started looking for anyone who could tell something about the activities of the monastery in general, as well as about the activities of Mrs. Mariam. They needed someone from the outside, as the nuns and monks would not utter a word. They even forbade themselves to speak among each other about anyone from outside the monastery. Detectives assumed that the testimony could be provided by doctors, as the monastery was once a place for treating patients with tuberculosis. The defenders were shocked when they learned the truth. There were essentially no visits from doctors for treatment or examination, only for death confirmation. And there were less than 150 such incidents. There were more suspicions than enough for active actions. Nearby, the police entered the monastery territory on December 4th, 1950. The operation lasted all night, after which the defenders freed dozens of people. Among them were 36 children. The police also searched the basements. There they found half-naked women tied up. Their bodies were literally covered with bruises and wounds. It's not surprising. If people were starved, they would rather eat scraps than normal food. After Mariam's arrest, the question arose how to inform her family. Obviously, those who died can't testify. And those who wrote all their property over to Mariam, it absolutely doesn't mean that someone was forced into it. people could go to such lengths willingly, even eager to cleanse their guilty souls. The police also started with more obvious and documented suspects. Illegal export of olive oil to Cyprus and tire import, and while the investigation was ongoing, it became important for the clergy to act. In February 1951, all religious communities that identified themselves as old calendarists declared themselves in Greece against the law. Now they seem to be looking at us with different eyes. Now that the abbess of the monastery was attending all court hearings with the icon of mercy, it seemed more against her. Even the founder of the monastery and the defender of the unity of the old believers sided with those who could be considered saints. And those who supported him now were highly suspicious. Nevertheless, by that time, the police were able to get testimonies from those who were tortured by the monastery's abbot and who managed to escape. People spoke about the horrors that happened to them in the basement. It turned out that they were forbidden to speak to each other, or they were not fed at all, or they were given stale bread and water. They had to remain awake for days. In order to punish the 3 offenders, Mariam took matters into her own hands and drank the potion, and those who seriously violated the established order, for example, were forced to give up everything, waiting in isolation in the basement. In February 1951, Mariam and 13 other women were officially accused of murder, robbery, conspiracy, extortion, and torture. But this did not deter those who truly believed that Mariam was their spiritual guide. Hundreds of her followers, both men and women, took to the streets in protest. They demanded the return of their leader and the dismissal of all charges. Exhausted from manipulations and lies, people have become skeptical about the government. They believed that these were just men, bishops and officials, who had squandered the wealth and power that was in the hands of an ordinary woman. And all the accusations of embezzlement were called nonsense. Speaking of people who came to the monastery, they did it willingly, and most of them were elderly. Of course, Mariam herself dismissed all the accusations. She mockingly called them satanic inventions. In court, the woman was praying and reading a prayer in a quiet voice. However, all this was in vain. In 1953, Mariam was given a total of 14 years in prison. But why not more, if it was about the death of people? Because the defenders did not have evidence that people died directly because of her actions. The court had to rely solely on the facts and evidence they had. It was established that 500 people donated all their property to the monastery, and some of them did it under pressure. And this weighs on the case. Mariam was also implicated in 150 murders due to negligence. It's about the sick with tuberculosis who unfortunately were trapped in the monastery walls to heal. At that time, it was not clear how to properly treat this disease, and in Greece there were serious problems with its spread. Even experts simply could not cope, as much as Mariam's actions led to the fact that people died. The real trouble got to the prison, and it seemed justice triumphed. But now she found herself in almost the same conditions as her victims. Yes, at first they even lived better in prison than in Mariam's monastery. Secondly, the woman died the following year, November 23, 1954. Specifically, she was already over 70 years old. So she carried her punishment fully and never escaped it. The number of victims who were not sick with tuberculosis, but were simply brutally tortured for the sake of fun and money, is still a subject of discussion. Most often, the number of 27 cases is mentioned. And since Mariam died before all the criminal proceedings were completed, she never bore responsibility for the death of these people. However, the investigation found relevant evidence primarily about 7 cases. And what's most surprising, even after the court verdict, even after the evidence was presented, Mariam's followers did not turn away from their leader. They took her body and buried it on the monastery grounds at the request of Abbot Metius. For them, she always remained a saint, a martyr who was killed because she steadfastly stood up for Christ's cause to the end. It's unclear what Mariam's motives were. Was she driven by a genuine revelation about serving God, or was she simply using religion as a cover for her nefarious actions? However, it's impossible to deny the deaths that occurred as a result of her actions. Thanks for watching the entire video, dear ones. All the best. Take care of yourself, your mental and physical health, and let's fight.